Ashton Barkley yet again found himself running through the walls of the Pokerplex, with two more animatronics close on his heels. For the first few hours it had been quiet, at least by standards kept by the location. Yes, the possessed animatronics were still roaming the halls, but many of them had fallen out of their habits to go after him, and seemed hesitant to even approach him. Barkley assumed that this was due to the events prior, as the majority of the animatronics he came into contact with that night were certain to have been on the ground floor of the foyer when he managed to outsmart not one, but two animatronics, leaving them as nothing more than piles of scrap metal. Many of them appeared scared or hesitant to even walk down the same corridors as him, but it didn't stop the odd machine from trying. If they came up behind him, they did go in for a swipe, but they'd soon stop if he even caught them trying. What he couldn't let them see was that he was significantly more terrified tonight than he had ever been of the animatronics in the building. The first hours of the shift were used as he intended, going from room to room cataloguing every animatronic whether it was possessed, dying, or powered down. He wrote brief descriptions of each in a logbook, along with a location of where to find them and a priority level for removal, before taking a photo using his watch and then moving on to the next machine. All the while he was doing this, he found himself looking for the man who he had seen last night, the engineer, of whom he suspected wouldn't just leave him to continue his mission unscathed. Not with what he knew about the underbelly of the site and all of the bodies that are buried below. So, rather than just looking for possessed animatronics, he had now found himself looking for tendencies providing evidence that they have been programmed to kill, similar to the three animatronics he faced in the smeltery. He began to realise every room he walked into was him taking another risk. Not only did he have to face living machines, but he now had to battle with the idea that there was something much more terrifying to him, a machine programmed to kill. This scared him more than a possessed animatronic ever could, as they usually had emotions that he could tap into to make contact with them and gain common ground, whereas a standard machine programmed to kill was the complete opposite. A machine programmed with the sole purpose of killing, with no other objective, meant he would always have to be afraid or cautious of walking into the next room. Every animatronic he would walk past was creating a breeding ground for more anxiety and uncertainty within him. If he got the slightest fraction of information wrong, it could potentially be the difference between life and death. But he had no choice but to continue forward. It was between his fate or the fate of the world, and it was an easy choice to make. Now, he found himself running through the walls of the fire section with two animatronics close behind him. Both were possessed, flame-based animatronics, but they each had their own themes attached to them. The first was an 8-foot bipedal bird animatronic covered from head to toe with artificial feathers. It was primarily coloured red and yellow, but also had tufts of cream feathers that surrounded the collar and three longer sections that protruded from the back of the head, similar to the cockatrice's longer crest feathers. The only part of this machine's body that was not covered in these feathers was its forearms and hands, which were designed to look more like talons, painted brown with white claws at the end of each finger, that were clearly made of metal. It moved like lightning, chasing Barkley around corners as though they were a straight line, not hindered in the slightest, running in close before attempting multiple variations of kicks and swipes similar to those perfected in various forms of martial arts. It was fast, dangerous, and had a slimmer frame that cut through the air like a knife. The second of the two animatronics was a little slower, but still quicker than the machines Barkley had faced on the previous night. It was a slightly bulkier animatronic, but was shorter, standing at roughly 6 foot. Its design was clearly based on the appearance of that of a hare or a rabbit, having long ears and wider, flat feet. Primarily it was coloured white, but had sections of plating that were blue, red, and yellow. What was most strange about this machine was that it had an additional theme. Along with the animal inspiration, it loosely had the appearance of a footballer, and had a function that was meant to be for shows, but doubled as a deadly weapon. As Barkley ran, a ball of flame shot past his head, singeing the fine hairs of his cheek. He stopped for a brief second, watching as the flames lit up the darkened hallway, before erupting against the far wall, setting a curtain alight. He looked back to see a plate closing and opening on the foot of the animatronic hare. Okay, that's a new one. As the machines got closer, Barkley turned away again and shot back down the hallway, in the direction that the flames had burned. A few more balls of fire shot past him, 2 on either side of his head, and another clipping the underside of his boot. Still, he ran, eyes darting around for any sign of escape. Another attack from the bird animatronic came, a leg sweeping towards his head, missing by an inch as he ducked, and crashing into the wall, before getting wedged between splintered wooden boards. That was it, the opening he had been looking for. The large frame of the hair animatronic couldn't get through as the bird animatronic struggled to pry its legs away from the wall. It remained silent but clawed at the wooden insulation, straining to pull away. A few stray balls of fire made it past, but most hit the bird animatronic and the hair let out a whirring mechanical screech. Both continued to run, but glanced back to see the state of the machine. They were struggling, but he knew it wouldn't take long for them to escape. He ducked around a corner and climbed into a ventilation shaft close to the ground, legs first so he could keep an eye on the corridor. In the hallway, the hair animatronic let out another screech. It tied up the space around the other machine, then looked up at the space above its head. It turned to take a few steps back, still staring at the open space above, before running up and jumping. Plates disconnected from the bottom of the animatronic's feet, revealing springs that launched it into the air above the bird, but landed just short and landed on its legs, ripping it from the wall and from its body. The hair didn't seem to care, picking itself up and continuing to run down the hall. Barkley, from his hiding spot, saw the hare's feet as it ran past, but could also hear the sound of claws dragging across the ground and a faint sound of crying. He took a moment in an attempt to decipher the events occurring in the corridor, but was stopped by a scream that echoed up through the vents. He turned to lie on his back and stared into the darkness as the sound grew more apparent. All other sounds seemed to fade as the horrible thought crossed his mind. How did a child get in here? It was the scream of a little girl. He scrambled back onto his front and proceeded to push himself down the ventilation shaft backwards. He continued to look in that direction, but admittedly couldn't see much as the rest of his body had taken up the majority of the space. Then he realised there was no sound outside. The clawing had stopped. He turned back and was faced with the glowing red eyes of the bird animatronic staring down into the vent from its opening. It used one arm to hold open the grate and clawed its way into the space, dragging itself into the small opening, creating indents in the walls on either side. It began to screech and scream as it got closer. When it had got its torso into the vent, it let go of the grate and began to use that talon to claw for Barkley's head, but was just out of reach. As the operative continued to snake further inside, it followed, the grate sliding over its back, then stopped suddenly. It continued to claw and scratch at the vent, tearing gashes in the metal, but didn't move and was just out of reach. The grate had slid over the feathered plating of the machine's torso, but had become lodged in the space between the two segments that made up the top and bottom halves of the creature's back. The only way it could free itself was if it crawled backwards out of the vent, which would be difficult with only one leg. It was beginning to panic. Barkley, on the other hand, just stared, eyes wide, and couldn't help but smile and laugh. He thought to himself, "Well, that was lucky. Maybe I should get myself stuck in vents more often." With it being his only option, he proceeded to crawl backwards into the darkness, towards where the supposed little girl's scream had came from. He had been crawling through the ventilation shafts for 20 minutes, desperately hoping that the little girl was okay. He was concerned but grateful to hear the screaming, because it was the only way he knew that she was still alive. He used his watch as a source of light while he was traversing through the vents, and managed to turn around at a point where 4 vents crossed. He was almost certain that he was now in the space between the floors of the ground floor and the ceiling of the basement, potentially crawling underneath numerous animatronics, but hadn't yet seen an opening that was clear enough for him to escape through. He continued, only focusing on the space in front of him, and the screams, desperate to get to her sooner rather than later. He had to turn back a few times due to dead ends, but was luckily able to work out where he had gone wrong. It was a horrible thing to think about, but the screams were beginning to grow louder, meaning he was getting closer to her. Unfortunately for him, The screams were also blocking out the sounds of something crawling in the vents around him. The screaming died down for a moment, and Barkley took a moment to listen to his surroundings. He heard the scampering of feet tapping against metal and waited to see if the sound stopped. It didn't, as something seemed to now be running in his direction. Barkley winced, praying it wasn't an animatronic, when a grey blur came running past him. A rat. He sniggered, allowing himself to feel the relief as the rat continued down the tunnel. He raised his watch to eye level, camera pointing in its direction, and for a moment the space was a little darker. He was going to laugh about this later and wanted to get a photo. The shutter of the camera clicked and the flash of blue light lit up the walls, floor, and the yellow and blue body of an animatronic spider writhing and scrambling up ahead. He watched as the machine picked the rat up in its mouth and chewed it until it became a bloody pulp. It mimicked the motion of swallowing, slightly raising its head and allowing the motion to flow through its body, before the mass fell to the ground from an opening where the head and body connected. It was smaller than the other animatronics he had seen, but it still scraped its clawed feet across the metal, making indentations as it stalked closer. The scraping was deathly, but Barkley couldn't look away. He kept his eyes locked on the monstrosity, even as it walked towards him. Its body was rusted in places, and it had a dark brown, almost black ooze leaking from its mouth. It was missing 2 of its 6 eyes, and was scuffed up in multiple areas. Barkley slowly pushed himself back, but kept an eye on it nonetheless. The steel hurt as his stomach pressed against it and his body began to tense in fear. In that moment he saw no way out, and the thought of death had begun to well up inside him. His saving grace was when the little girl's screams began to break through the sounds of the animatronic, and he again knew that he could save her. Where there was fear, there was now determination. This machine wasn't attacking right out, but when he had seen it first it was scrambling, almost panicked. He couldn't understand why, as the machine that was looking him in the eye acted different, slow, menacing, conniving in place of rash and bloodthirsty. A thought crossed his mind. The flash of the camera might have had something to do with the erratic behaviour. He realised the machine would have been using a form of night vision to make its way through the vents, meaning it could see in the dark where Barkley couldn't. But it also meant that any excess light would damage the machine and its ability to see. He worked out that when the camera flashed, it had momentarily blinded the animatronic, causing it to scramble in a panic. Which is when he decided to raise the camera to eye level again. With a flash, the machine writhed, it scrambled and pounded against the sides of the shaft, but rather than attacking Barkley in the dazed state, it appeared to step backwards in the direction it had came from. It lifted its 2 front claws in an attempt to cover its eyes as the second and third flash lit up the space. Barkley was fascinated but had no time to waste, and continued to press his watch until the spider turned and ran into the darkness. The machine was clearly not out of order, but with how quickly it had escaped, it definitely had no intention of attacking him again anytime soon. Barkley was learning so much more about animatronics here than he had ever thought he would. He pulled the notebook and pen from his trouser pocket and began to write down his findings, but aimed to continue as quickly as he could, still giving his mind a second to ponder the thought of making this building a permanent site for the agency. The thought remained, but he had to find the little girl. The operative reached a point where the screams were unbearable, loud and unforgiving. He looked through the grate in the vent and stared down. Below him was a chasm of space that was dark, apart from the flickering light of animatronic eyes amongst piles of broken, twitching animatronic body parts. It was as though he had found himself looking at an animatronic graveyard. He reached his hand through the bars of the grate and used a coin to unscrew it so he could get out. Before unscrewing the last bolt, he pressed his legs against the vent walls and spread his body along the surface so he could hold onto the grate with his other hand, so as to not make any noise. He struggled for a moment, but managed to unscrew the panel and lifted it into the opening, sliding it on the opposite side to where he was lying. Once the grate was open, he leaned out, head hanging there as he scanned for any sign of working animatronics or a little girl amongst the piles of scrap and refuse. He grew concerned as the screaming began to grow quiet again, and he was adamant he didn't want to lose sight of her. He climbed out, legs first, and dangled himself over the chasm by his arms. He saw the largest pile of debris and aimed to swing over to it, in the hopes that he could get enough momentum to land safely onto it. He swung once, and one hand slipped as the sweat softened his grip. Now hanging with only one arm, he struggled, but managed to whip it back up and grab hold of the ledge once more. Sweat began to collect on his brow as he stared down at the ground below him, rolling down his face. A single droplet rolled off his nose, as if to remind him of the drop, into what felt like a bottomless pit. He took a long breath in, looked back up, tightened his grip, and swung once more. 1, 2, and 3! Time seemed to stop momentarily as his hands left the cold steel. He landed on a pile with a crash, feet first, but let out an adrenaline-fueled laugh and breathed a sigh of relief. He leaned into the metal, heart pounding rapidly against his chest and breathing heavily, when the surface seemed to start moving. Barclay's landing had dislodged the scrap underneath him, and parts had begun to slip out of place, rolling down to the ground. He scrambled and clawed for anything solid in the pile when he wrapped his hands around what appeared to be a leg. The pieces of scrap that fell to the ground landed with a clatter which seemed to echo forever in the open space. He winced and looked out, praying that nothing had heard the noise, but he slowly opened his eyes to see nothing had appeared. The child's screaming had come to a complete halt, and concern began to rise in Barclay's mind again. He looked around frantically for any sign of the child, for any torn fabric, a lost shoe, or anything fresh that might have been lying amongst the rust and mildew, which was when he saw a teddy bear lying on the ground. He climbed down as quickly, but as gently as he could, not wanting to dislodge any more scrap. He grabbed hold of the most sturdy elements he could find, slipping a few times but regaining his balance. When he was close to the bottom, he let go and slipped on a sheet of steel, but landed on his feet and skidded down to the ground. Wet footsteps slapped against the solid ground when he reached the bottom, but when he had regained his balance, he walked towards the teddy. Part of him wanted to believe the screaming was actually part of an overactive imagination, or that he was too tired and hadn't been getting enough sleep between his shifts, but the teddy being there was enough evidence for him to decide otherwise. It was a clean, brown teddy with a black top hat and bow tie. It was relatively clean, apart from the smudge of mildew that had been smeared on it when it was supposedly dropped. Compared to the space around him, this toy looked fresh, and the mildew it had landed in was dense. He looked at it, trying to find a name or anything, but found nothing. He stared out into the space again, eyes darting looking for an exit, when he saw something moving in the distance, something that was too far away to make out. Barclay was hopeful and ran over to the silhouette of whatever it was. He began shouting in its direction, "Wait there, I'm on my way, please don't go anywhere." He began to run full pelt, feet slapping against the ground, splashing water up his legs and shirt. As he rubbed water from his eyes and he screamed again, "Come here, it's okay, look, I've got your teddy, let's get you out of here." He began to cry. He had found her, or so he thought. When he got closer, he saw a red streak run away into the shadows. It was what he was following, but it seemed to be running away from him. He rubbed his eyes once more, rubbing away the tears and calming himself, and began to wonder why whatever it was running. It could have still been the child, but it was moving away from him. He stood, dumbfounded, when the clatter of metal drew away his gaze. Suddenly, a pile of scrap close to where the silhouette was began to collapse, falling to the ground. It was slow at first, a few arms and legs slipping from the top of the pile, but a large yellow eye seemed to look out from where they had fallen. It looked directly at Barkley, and the space began to widen as a growl rumbled out, knocking more debris from what was starting to look like a large animatronic head. It turned its head and whipped the scrap into the air. It rained down as the machine writhed and wriggled, scrap rolling from the space where it had laid. It stood upright and whipped its arms above its head, revealing two huge fin-like wings as it roared. Body parts were thrown across the space, almost crushing Barkley as he dodged and dived for cover. It was a huge animatronic. Barkley hid behind another pile of scrap while the machine was preoccupied with its shrieking, but peeked around the corner to admire it. The creature he was looking at was truly terrifying, an animatronic version of what appeared to be a hybrid of a dragon and a hammerhead shark. It stood at 18 feet and was larger than any animatronic Barkley had ever seen. It was primarily coloured blue but had a red and yellow underbelly with a bright yellow star on the end of its snout. Looking at it, Barkley instantly assumed it would have similar capabilities to the orange dragon that he had destroyed the night before, but its size was not even close. The admiration soon turned to thoughts of terror and outrage as he began to unintentionally concoct images of the little girl being slaughtered by the beast, but snapped back into reality when the machine began scanning the space, looking for him. The little girl's voice rang out, "Help me! Please help me!" and Barkley watched as the dragon animatronic reared back its head, leaned in, and roared in the direction of the call. It turned on its heels and took a few steps before running in the voice's direction. Barkley, without a moment to lose, stepped out from hiding, picked up a piece of debris, and shouted at it, "Stay away from her! If you want someone, come and get me!" before throwing a chunk of rock and seeing it shatter against the animatronic's plating. It turned slowly and its eyes flickered from yellow to red for a second, letting out a low growl and turning around, unintentionally whipping the operative with its tail. He slid across the wet ground and banged his head on a faceplate. Still, he couldn't let the pain get to him. The creature looped through the same motions, rearing its head before roaring and running straight at him.